What would it take to prove that a population is still the same people after slavery, after emancipation, after segregation, after migration changed where they lived, and after generations began calling themselves by different names? Because if a people can survive all of that, then their identity cannot depend on a label alone. It would have to survive in the historical record. It would have to survive in families and memories and in institutions and in what one generation carried into the next. That's the case before us today. Not whether Black Americans share the same skin color, nor whether every Black person in America has the same ancestry. Not even whether a modern political label can tell us who somebody is. The question is, what makes a people? And does the evidence show that the historic Black American population substantially descended from people subjected to slavery in the United States became a distinct American people? One modern name has increasingly been applied to that population: foundational Black American. But in this investigation, the name does not get to prove the case. The evidence does. Scripture gives us a reason to take this question seriously, because Scripture does not describe humanity only as isolated individuals. Revelation chapter 7, verse 9 speaks of nations, kindreds, peoples, and tongues. Acts 17:26 says that God has made of one blood all nations of men to dwell on the face of the earth. So Scripture gives us two boundaries. Humanity shares a common origin, but human beings also exist historically as distinct people and nations. That means race and peoplehood are not the same question. Race can classify a population from the outside, but peoplehood asks what preserves continuity from the inside. Does the historical evidence establish that a distinct Black American people actually formed in America? Only after answering that can we ask whether a modern name like foundational Black Americans actually describes that people. And this case will use the same evidentiary discipline. That's correspondence, then correlation. And only if the evidence survives, identification. Let's begin. Here's the claim under examination, and it's pretty straightforward. The historic Black American population substantially descended from people who were subjected to U.S. slavery. They were shaped through emancipation, Reconstruction, segregation, a internal migration, institution building, and cultural transmission. They experienced what sociologists would call a ethnogenesis. They became more than a racial category. Now, you'll recall in Genesis chapter 10, it repeatedly describes populations according to, now watch, families, tongues, lands, and their nations. That does not give us a modern forensic definition of peoplehood, but it does establish something very important. Scripture does not reduce collective identity to appearance. So, before we examine one Black American family, one migration, or one institution, we need to establish a standard. We need a peoplehood test. And that standard has to be defined before we apply it to Black Americans. Otherwise, we could just simply choose criteria that produce the answers that, well, we want. But that would not be investigation. So, what evidence would we require to identify any population as a distinct people? For a moment, remove Black Americans from the question. If we were examining any population in history, what would we need to see? We would need historical formation. That's a population that's shaped by a sufficiently shared historical experience. We would need intergenerational continuity. That's families and communities persisting from one generation into the next. We would need a collective memory. That's not every person remembering exactly the same story, but a past that repeatedly is transmitted across generations. We would expect institutions, churches, schools, businesses, media, that's organizations who are capable of carrying community beyond the lifespan of individual witnesses. We would expect kinship and social networks. That's families who are maintaining relationships across distance and time. Relatives helping relatives move. We'd expect communities that are rebuilding after geography changes. We'd expect culture, language, music, religion, family customs, shared ways of remembering and belonging. And finally, we would need continuity through change. Why is that? Because no people remains frozen. Names change, families mix, people migrate. The question is whether enough continuity survived that the population remained historically recognizable. Now, in all of that, I want you to notice what is not required. Genetic purity, skin color alone, one political ideology, one religious belief, or one permanent name. Now we have a standard, but the next step is evidence. One place where continuity becomes concrete is inside a family. So we want to look at a family record. My family, the Colliers. When I was a child, I didn't even think of family history as evidence. It was only as I began to really research and study for this particular conversation. Family was just simply family. And I remember Collier family reunions where there would be hundreds of relatives gathered together. My granddad and his five brothers, they would bring all of the younger generations together and they would tell us the family history. Now, years later, when this investigation's taking place, that memory becomes testable. Memory can be very powerful, but memory can also be wrong. So the question becomes, does the surviving record agree with what I remember? It documents large multi-generational reunions, sometimes representing as many as 5 generations, along with a deliberate family tree preservation and the transmission of our family history. That doesn't prove that every story that was told at the reunions was accurate, but independently, it confirms the practice itself. The memory and the archive have correspondence. My family was deliberately carrying its history forward. The archive goes something like this. Vicey, my great-grandmother, was born to enslaved parents. We had our origin in Lawrenceville, Virginia. It also identified my great-grandfather, George, as being formerly enslaved. So I'm the direct descendant of the American slave trade. So George and Vicey were what we could call the emancipation generation in this direct line. They made it through emancipation. My grandfather, Willie Ben, belonged to the first generation who were actually born free. That distinction matters because emancipation only changed legal condition. It did not create the family. It only changed their legal condition. So my family crossed the boundary from slavery to emancipation to a generation born free without disappearing. Some members of the Collier family left Lawrenceville, Virginia, and established themselves in Pennsylvania, primarily for this conversation, Philadelphia. The archive preserved a very important detail. My Aunt Marie ended up in Philadelphia, and as her brothers and sisters were going north, they landed at her house. This is what is known as migration through kinship. That's a family member who arrives at a location and then others follow. The family relationship is what helped make the relocation possible. So at that point, the family case begins to correspond with the broader understanding that we know as the Great Migration from the South to the North. We're just following one family that happens to be my own. Now, this Collier family migration doesn't prove the national history. The Great Migration story, that's been independently established. We know that as historical fact. But what this family, my family, gives us is a close-up view of how migration could preserve continuity rather than destroy it. So the idea that Black American families don't know their family history is disproven just based on this one family case. The geography changed, kinship remained, but after the migration, this evidence widens beyond one family. Peoplehood cannot be established by ancestry alone. Peoplehood. That population must also possess mechanisms that are capable of carrying the collective life forward. So across Black American history, institutions did that work. That is what made the Black church play such a prominent role in Black America. This is why businesses became essential. This is why journalism and cultural networks, and then later mass media played such a prominent role in the experience of Blacks in America who were descendant from slavery. That larger picture intersects with my dad, Ulysses K. Williams Sr. Now, his family migrated from Denmark, South Carolina, similar story. But what's interesting is my dad's Philadelphia career included Black radio, journalism, artist promotion, management, independent media production, and cultural broadcasting. He was one of the original pioneering Black on-air radio personalities in the country. Now we're talking legacy. But it provides a concrete example of that greater participation in the larger Black urban cultural infrastructure. This is a family that had moved north, now participating in institutions that are capable of carrying information, music, identity, and community far beyond one household. At this point, before we go any further, I want you to mark this evidence. I want you to begin to leave your comments about things that this connects with things you know about your family. But now that we've established that, we have to try, as any good investigation would do, we have to try to break the case. We need to do some cross-examination, because maybe all we're actually seeing is race. Black Americans were classified from the outside by race. And so they say, well, at one point we were colored, we were Negroes, we were Afro-Americans. And all of these classifications were racial classifications that came from the outside. But no racial classification can fully explain the internal evidence that we're exploring. It cannot explain kinship continuity. Yes, race can explain part of how the population was treated, but it does not fully explain how the population reproduced itself. So race alone is insufficient. There is this thing of regional diversity, because Black life in Virginia looked nothing like Black life in Philadelphia. Mississippi did not look exactly like Chicago. But peoplehood does not require every region to be identical. The question is whether variation exists inside of a larger historical continuity. And here, the evidence says yes. What about admixture? What about people marrying into the family? Black Americans are not a genetically isolated population, but this case was never built on genetic purity. Admixture can alter ancestry, but it does not automatically erase families, institutions, memory, or shared historical formation. What about immigration? What about Black immigrants from Africa, from the Caribbean, from Latin America, and elsewhere? They may enter the same broad racial category, Black, but they can carry different national, ethnic, linguistic, and migration histories. That doesn't make one population more authentically Black than another, but it shows that racial classification and historical peoplehood are different questions. This is what FBA delineation is actually dealing with. A person can be classified as Black, but we're talking about whether a unique people experienced an ethnogenesis in America that fundamentally created a new people group. This is what we're examining. Here's a question. If the name changes, does the population disappear? Not necessarily. Names can be imposed, rejected, claimed, and changed. The relevant question is whether the underlying historical population can still be traced through those changes. And it can. So after testing race, regional diversity, admixture, immigration, changing terminologies, the peoplehood still stands. The competing explanations do not account for the full pattern as well as historical continuity does. So now we can ask whether correspondence has become correlation, whether correlation is strong enough for identification. The evidence supports identifying a distinct historic Black American people who were formed within the United States. But what about FBA? It's where we started. Foundational Black Americans. We can return to that term now because that's how we opened the case. And I want you to note the term, foundational Black American. I want you to notice the order. We're not beginning with the name and then searching for evidence to justify it. No, we began with the population. We established the test. Then we examined some evidence. And then we challenge the conclusion. So what does FBA add? First, the population is older than the label. So FBAs and none of its proponents created the population. It's a modern lineage-centered attempt to name, identify, and delineate a population that already existed. And at that level, the term corresponds to something that's historically real. But the label doesn't automatically prove every claim that's attached to it. Those are different investigations. It's not established that African American is a false identity. It doesn't make Black immigrants less authentically Black. That tends to be applied to the descendants of U.S. chattel slavery itself. And note, DNA is not the final judge of peoplehood. Ancestry matters, lineage matters, but peoplehood is larger than ancestry percentage. The evidence can establish the people without endorsing every political claim. This is where this investigation stops. People survive because history is carried forward. But investigators, there's one boundary that we cannot cross. Identifying a people historically does not identify that people biblically. Scripture recognizes peoples and nations. But if someone now claims that this historic Black American population can be identified with a people already named in Scripture, that is a new claim. And that requires a new investigation. It's not, does something match about that people and a biblically identified people? It's, does the evidence establish identity? Can the claim survive correspondence, correlation, and identification? A match is not proof. Identity is not something that we have to invent. There's a record, there's a history, there's a story that came before us, and understanding that story changes how we understand ourselves. But discovering where we came from raises another question. What does that identity mean now? That's where the next investigation begins. And until then, I want you to keep searching the scriptures. Keep asking questions and never stop following the evidence. I'm Darryl Arnez. This has been the investigation, Scripture Uncovered. We'll see you in the next investigation.